Good evening and welcome to the Legends of Smooth Jazz. It's episode 2 for this Saturday, January 14th, 2023. I'm your host, Jason DeCanio, and welcome to this second episode where we're picking up where we left off from last week. As you know, we were looking at Miles Davis. So tonight, part 2 of the Legends of Smooth Jazz with Miles Davis right here, right now. Here and we're ready to go. Welcome to this edition of the Legends of Smooth Jazz. I'm your host, Jason DeCanio, and it's Saturday night again. We're here, January 14th, 2023. Hope you had a great week, and we're ready to go because, as you know, when we're ready to go, it's time for a lot to happen. Okay, we're picking up where we left off from last week as we were looking at Miles Davis, the well-known trumpet horn player who has graced us with his presence for a long time. He started way back in 1944, but now we're going to go to the next loop, which is 49 to 55, signing with Prestige, Heroic Addiction, and Hard Bop. Here we go. After returning from Paris in mid-1949, he became depressed and found little work except a short engagement with Powell in October and guest spots in New York City, Chicago, and Detroit until 1950. He was falling behind in hotel rent, and attempts were made to repossess his car. His heroin use became an expensive addiction, and Davis, not yet 24 years old, lost my sense of discipline, lost my sense of control over my life, and started to drift. In August of 1950, Cawthorn gave birth to Davis's second son, Miles IV. Davis befriended boxer Johnny Bratton, which began his interest in the sport. Davis left Cawthorn and his 3 children in New York City in the hands of his friend, jazz singer Betty Carter. He toured with Eckstein and Billie Holiday and was arrested for heroin possession in Los Angeles. The story was reported in Downbeat magazine, which led to a further reduction in work, though he was acquitted weeks later. By the 1950s, Davis had become more skilled and was experimenting with the middle register of the trumpet alongside harmonies and rhythms. In January of 1951, Davis's fortunes improved when he signed a 1-year contract with Prestige after owner Bob Weinstock became a fan of the Nonet. Davis chose Lewis, trombonist Benny Green, bassist Percy Heath, saxophonist Sonny Rollins, and drummer Roy Haynes, and they recorded what became part of Miles Davis and Horns in 1956. Davis was hired for other studio dates in 1951 and began to transcribe scores for record labels to fund his heroin addiction. His second session for Prestige was released on The New Sounds in 1951, Dig in 1956, and Conception in 1956. Davis supported his heroin habit by playing music and living the life of a hustler, exploiting prostitutes and receiving money from friends. By 1953, his addiction began to impair his playing. His drug habit became public in a downbeat interview with Cab Calloway, whom he never forgave as it brought him all pain and suffering. He returned to St. Louis and stayed with his father for several months. After a brief period with Roach and Mingus in September of '53, he returned to his father's home, where he concentrated on addressing his addiction. Davis lived in Detroit for about 6 months, avoiding New York City, where it was easy to get drugs. Though he used heroin, he was still able to perform locally with Elvin Jones and Tommy Flanagan as part of Billy Mitchell's house band at the Bluebird Club. He was also pimping a little. However, he was able to end his addiction, and in February of 1954, he returned to New York City feeling good for the first time in a long time, mentally and physically stronger, and joined a gym. He informed Weinstock and Blue Note that he was ready to record with a quintet, which he was granted. He considered the albums that resulted from these and earlier sessions, the Miles Davis Quartet and Miles Davis Volume 2, very important because he felt his performances were particularly strong. He was paid roughly $750, which is the equivalent to about $7,600 in 2021 for each album, and refused to give away his publishing rights. Davis abandoned the bebop style and turned to the music of pianist Ahmed Jamal, whose approach and use of space influenced him. When he returned to the studio in June of 1955 to record the Musings of Miles, he wanted a pianist like Jamal and chose Red Garland, Blue Haze in 1956, Bag's Groove in 57, Walking in 57, and Miles Davis and the Modern Jazz Giants in 59 documented the evolution of his sound with the Harman mute placed close to the microphone and the use of more spacious and relaxed phrasing. He assumed a central role in hard bop, less radical in harmony and melody, and used popular songs and American standards as starting points for improvisation. Hard bop distanced itself from cool jazz with a harder beat and music inspired by the blues. A few critics considered Walkin', April of 1954, the album that created the hard bop genre. Davis gained a reputation for being cold, distant, and easily angered. He wrote that in 1954, Sugar Ray Robinson was the most important thing in my life besides music, and he adopted Robinson's arrogant attitude. He showed contempt for critics and the press. Davis had an operation to remove polyps from his larynx in 1955 of October, and the doctors told him to remain silent after the operation, but he got into an argument that permanently damaged his vocal cords and gave him a raspy voice for the rest of his life. He was called the Prince of Darkness, adding a patina of mystery to his public persona. July of 1955, Davis's fortunes improved considerably when he played at the Newport Jazz Festival with a lineup of Monk, Heath, drummer Connie Kay, and horn players Zoot Sims and Jerry Mulligan. The performance was praised by critics and audiences alike, who considered it to be a highlight of the festival, as well as helping Davis, the least well-known musician in the group, to increase his popularity among affluent white audiences. He tied with Dizzy Gillespie for Best Trumpeter in the 1955 Downbeat magazine's Readers' Poll. George Avakian of Columbia Records heard Davis's performance at Newport and wanted to sign him to the label. Davis had 1 year left on his contract with Prestige, which required him to release 4 more albums. He signed a contract with Columbia that included a $4,000 advance, equivalent to about $40,460 in 2021, and required that his recordings for Columbia remain unreleased until his agreement with Prestige expired. At the request of Avakian, he formed the Miles Davis Quintet for a performance at Cafe Bohemia. The quintet contained Sonny Rollins on tenor saxophone, Red Garland on piano, Paul Chambers on double bass, and Philly Joe Jones on drums. Rollins was replaced by John Coltrane, completing the membership of the first quintet. To fulfill Davis's contract with Prestige, this new group worked through 2 marathon sessions in May and October of 1956 that were released by the label as 4 LPs, Cookin' with Miles Davis Quintet in 57, Relaxin' with the Miles Davis Quintet in 58, Working with the Miles Davis Quintet in 60, and Steamin' with the Miles Davis Quintet in 61. Each album was critically acclaimed and helped establish Davis's quintet as one of the best. The style of the group was an extension of their experience playing with Davis. He played long, legato, melodic lines, while Coltrane contrasted with energetic solos. Their live repertoire was a mix of bebop, standards from the Great American Songbook, and pre-bop eras, and traditional tunes. They appeared on Roundabout Midnight, Davis's first album for Columbia. In 1956, he left his quintet temporarily to tour Europe as part of the Birdland All-Stars, which included the Modern Jazz Quartet and French and German musicians. In Paris, he reunited with Greco, and they were lovers for many years. He then returned home, reunited his quintet, and toured the U.S. for 2 months. Conflict arose on tour when he grew impatient with the drug habits of Jones and Coltrane. Davis was trying to live a healthier life by exercising and reducing his alcohol, but he continued to use cocaine. And at the end of the tour, he fired Jones and Coltrane and replaced them with Sonny Rollins and Art Taylor. November of 1957, Davis went to Paris and recorded the soundtrack to Ascenseur pour l'Echeflande, directed by Louis Malle and starring Jean Moreau, consisting of French jazz musicians Barney Willen, Pierre Michelot, and René Outreger, and American drummer Kenny Clarke. The group avoided a written score and instead improvised while they watched the film in a recording studio. After returning to New York, Davis revived his quintet with Adderley and Coltrane, who was clean from his drug habit. Now a sextet, the group recorded material in early 1958 that was released on Milestones, an album that demonstrated Davis's interest in modal jazz. A performance by Les Ballets Africains drew him to slower, deliberate music that allowed the creation of solos from harmony rather than chords. By May of 1958, he had replaced Jones with drummer Jimmy Cobb, and Garland left the group, leaving Davis to play piano on Sid's Ahead for Milestones. He wanted someone who could play modal jazz, so he hired Bill Evans, a young pianist with a background in classical music. Evans had an impressionistic approach to piano, and his ideas greatly influenced Davis, but after 8 months of touring, a tired Evans left. Wynton Kelly, his replacement, brought to the group a swinging style that contrasted with Evans' delicacy. The sextet made their recording debut on Jazz Track in 1958. By early 1957, Davis was exhausted from recording and touring and wished to pursue new projects. In March, the 30-year-old Davis told journalists of his intention to retire soon and revealed offers he had received to teach at Harvard University and be a musical director at a record label. Avakian agreed that it was time for Davis to explore something different, but Davis rejected his suggestion of returning to his nonet as he considered that a step backward. Avakian then suggested that he work with a bigger ensemble similar to Music for Brass in 1957, an album of orchestral and brass-arranged music led by Gunther Schuller, featuring Davis as a guest soloist. Well, Davis accepted and worked with Gil Evans in what became a 5-album collaboration from 1957 to 1962. Miles Ahead in 57 showcased Davis on flugelhorn and a rendition of The Maids of Cadiz by Leo Delibes, the first piece of classical music that Davis recorded. Evans devised orchestral passages as transitions, thus turning the album into one long piece of music. Porgy and Bess in 1959 includes arrangements of pieces from George Gershwin's opera. Sketches of Spain from 60 contain music by Joaquin Rodrigo and Manuel de Falla, and originals by Evans. The classical musicians had trouble improvising, while the jazz musicians couldn't handle the difficult arrangements. But the album was a critical success, selling over 120,000 copies in the U.S. Davis performed with an orchestra conducted by Evans at Carnegie Hall in May of 1961 to raise money for charity. The pair's final album was Quiet Nights in 1963, a collection of bossa nova songs released against their wishes. Evans stated it was only half an album and blamed the record company. Davis blamed producer Tio Macero and refused to speak to him for more than 2 years. The box sets, Miles Davis and Gil Evans, the complete Columbia studio recordings in 1996, won the Grammy Award for Best Historical Album and Best Album Notes in 1997. In March and April of 1959, Davis recorded what some consider his greatest album, Kind of Blue. He named the album for its mood. He called back Bill Evans, as the music had been planned around Evans' piano style. Both Davis and Evans were familiar with George Russell's ideas about modal jazz, but Davis neglected to tell pianist Wynton Kelly that Evans was returning, so Kelly appeared only on one song, Freddie Freeloader. The sextet had played So What and All Blues at performances, but the remaining 3 compositions they saw for the first time in the studio. Released in August of 1959, Kind of Blue was an instant success, with widespread radio airplay and rave reviews from critics. It has remained a strong seller over the years. By November of 2019, the album reached 5-time platinum certification from the Recording Industry Association of America for shipments of over 5 million copies in the U.S., making it one of the most successful jazz albums in history. In 2009, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a resolution that honored it as a national treasure. Back in August of 1959, during a break in a recording session at the Birdland nightclub in New York City, Davis was escorting a blonde-haired woman to a taxi outside the club when policeman Gerald Kildoff told him to move on. Davis said that he was working at the club and he refused to move. Kildoff arrested and grabbed Davis as he tried to protect himself. Witnesses said the policeman hit Davis in the stomach with a nightstick without provocation. 2 detectives held the crowd back while a third approached Davis from behind and beat him over the head. Davis was taken to jail, charged with assaulting an officer, then taken to the hospital where he received 5 stitches. By January of 1960, he was acquitted of disorderly conduct and third-degree assault. He later stated the incident changed my whole life and whole attitude again, made me feel bitter and cynical again when I was starting to feel good about the things that had changed in this country. Davis and his sextet toured to support Kind of Blue. He persuaded Coltrane to play with the group on one final European tour in the spring of 1960. Coltrane then departed to form his quartet, though he returned for some tracks on Davis's album Someday My Prince Will Come. Its front cover shows a photograph of his wife, Frances Taylor, after Davis demanded that Columbia depict black women on his covers in 1957. We're going to stop there. And when we come back on part 3, we'll look at 1963 to 1968 and see what's going on as he gets into the 70s and continues to be a hand and a thorn in everybody's side. I'm Jason DeCanio, thanking you very much for this episode 2. Remember, the Legends of Jazz is going to be a long one with many parts to this one person because, as you know, this is an 80-year history of the legends of not only jazz itself and smooth jazz, but all types of jazz in all shapes and all sizes and all forms. All right? So bear with us. We'll get to your favorite jazz person down the road. And if you would like to submit any suggestions, please do. Send me a line. Drop me a line. Let me know what you want to hear or hear about. And we'll definitely get that person's renditional legendary legacy ready to go. All this is possible, and you help it make it possible. Thank you again for joining me tonight. We will see you next week for part 3 of a look of Miles Davis and his sextet. For now, have a good night. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Don't forget to subscribe to the David3000 Network for great more content like this one.